It's time for another episode of the Sean Tabbitt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, dig into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my very special guest is Tony Cooke, and we're going to be discussing his new book, In Search of Paul, Unleashing the Power of Legendary Mentors in Your Life. Tony, it is always a pleasure to speak with you. Welcome back to the show.
Sean, thank you. It's good to be back with you again.
And I was looking through my notes this morning. I think it's been about a year and a half since you were on the podcast. So we're going to kick this off a little bit in the same place we did last time. So let's begin by having you share kind of that shorter elevator pitch version of the Tony Cooke origin story. I know some of my viewers and listeners are meeting you for the first time today. So give them a little context. What are a few things they should know about you?
Thank you, Sean. I was raised in a mainline traditional denominational church in Indiana. Very thankful for that upbringing. At the age of 18, I was introduced to the person of the Holy Spirit. He was no longer just part of a formula and the recitation of a creed, and dynamically changed my life at the age of 18. Got married, studied at university a couple of years, got married. We moved to Tulsa in 1979. My wife and I are coming up on our 43rd year of marriage. Studied at Rhema Bible Training Center and was an assistant pastor in a church for a few years, went on staff at Rhema for 18 and a half, and have been traveling. My wife and I have traveled full time for the last 20 years. We're actually coming up on our 20th anniversary in 1 month. And we've been privileged to preach in 31 nations, 47 states, written, 13 or 14 books, translated in 8 or 9 languages. And we love Jesus, and we love the church, and we love what we do.
Let's get into kind of we heard your story. Now let's talk a little bit about the story behind the book. I understand this is sort of a follow-up to a best-selling book that sold well for you in the past, In Search of Timothy. So how is this a follow-up to that? And just, it's one thing to also have readers say, man, this helped us. We need kind of what would be next. So how did this project get started?
Yeah, well, there's a million books on leadership, and so many of them are so good. And back when we first started traveling, I sensed a need I'd been an associate pastor for 22 years, essentially, served in supportive ministry. I never have been a senior pastor. And, but as a staff member, I saw the need for great team members, that top level leaders are so limited unless they've got a good staff and a good team around them. It can be volunteers, but just like Paul had Timothy and Moses had Joshua, so on, there need to be great team members, not just great preachers and that type of thing. So we wrote In Search of Timothy to stress and emphasize the need for and the qualities of those who serve in what we call supportive ministry. And for years, that book's been translated into about 8 languages. And for years, people would come up and say, oh, we love In Search of Timothy, but have you ever thought about writing a book called In Search of Paul? And honestly, I hadn't too much, but I got enough questions. And over the years, I began seeing that so many people in the body of Christ really desire mentoring. And they desire to have some, and it's ideal. This book is certainly not meant to take the place of having, people, individuals that can speak into our life, whether they're peers. The Bible talks about, encourage one another, edify one another. We need human beings, but we also see the mentoring that took place in the Bible, the way Jesus trained his disciples. Jesus just had them be with him, and he'd give them assignments, and he'd kind of critique and evaluate. He wasn't a harsh taskmaster, but, there were times they got out of line, and, Peter cutting off a guy's ear, and James and John wanting to call down fire from heaven and destroy people. And, Jesus kind of had to say, okay, guys, that's not how we do things. That's not our purpose. That's not. And so Jesus spent those 3 years, not just ministering to multitudes, but he was really coaching and mentoring his hands-on team members. He preached to crowds, but he really gave a lot of personal coaching. And I don't say this in any way, shape, or form, because pastors often are so busy overseeing an entire organization, doing so many different things that they don't, some people go to work for a pastor and they think, well, I just thought he was going to spend time with me one-on-one, and he was just going to coach me, and we're going to have lunch every day, and he's just going to pour his life into me and things like that. And, if you happen to have a pastor that's able to do that, God bless you. That's great. Most pastors would love to be able to have that kind of time to do that kind of thing. And, for example, I worked for 2 pastors over a 22-year period, and they were wonderful. I have so much gratitude and appreciation, for what my pastors taught me. But part of our purpose in writing In Search of Paul was, first of all, to examine and explore how the Apostle Paul mentored and coached Timothy. Timothy just didn't sit there at Paul's feet all the time getting all these golden nuggets. A lot of times Timothy was off doing errands for Paul. And, Timothy, go to Corinth and go to Ephesus. And, Timothy's great usefulness to Paul much of the time was when he was not with Paul. He was out doing stuff for Paul. And so the very fact that we have 1 Timothy and 2 Timothy are indicative of Paul's desire to coach Timothy, to mentor him, to give him advice and counsel, and how much those of us that might be young in the faith or young in the ministry, we crave the wisdom. If we're smart, we will crave the wisdom of those who have gone before us, those who have more experience. Because I've learned in 42 years of ministry, I can either learn from somebody else's mistakes or I can just make them all myself. And I don't have enough time to make all the mistakes myself. I don't have the emotional capacity to make that many failures. So I want to learn from people like Martin Luther, and Martin Luther recorded, well, he didn't actually record it, his students did. He would sit around the dinner table with students night after night after night, and they would ask him questions, and he would give them counsel and, advice and mentoring, and these students would write out what he taught them. And it's compiled in different collections called Table Talks with Martin Luther. John Wesley gave prolific instructions to his young ministers. Charles Spurgeon had a school where he trained young ministers. And, you can read all that in Lectures to My Students by Charles Spurgeon. And the list just goes on and on. In this book, In Search of Timothy, or In Search of Paul, rather, we identify about 50 different leaders through church history who had stuff to say to their young proteges, to their young assistants, to their students, to their ministers on staff. And what we did is we culled what I believed was the richest and the best information, and we just put it into one book so that our readers could not only find out, how did Paul mentor Timothy, and how did Jesus mentor his disciples, but how did Luther, Wesley, Spurgeon, Moody, just the list goes on and on of, I think I counted 50 different ministers we quote from, some extensively, some just a quote or two. But A.B. Simpson, Gordon Lindsay, just all these great leaders throughout church history, how did they coach their young students in 2 areas? Number one, personal spiritual growth. And number 2, ministerial integrity and skill and things of that nature. So I don't know. Sorry for rambling so much.
No, it was a good rambling. So thank you. In terms of learning from other people's experiences and mistakes, I always like to think of it as you can either hit your head on the wall or ask the other guy about the dent in the wall from his head, and you'll get
Yeah,
some perspective on that.
exactly.
I love kind of just the range of great minds that you've put together for the message in the book, just in the sense that a lot of people who are up and coming have no idea often who some of these people are, and
Yeah.
this may be the only place they're going to encounter Spurgeon or people who are like, how could you not have heard of this person? And that for me, I get excited because I feel like that opens up the possibility of being like, oh, that was like a sticky, pithy quote. That's really intriguing. My hope is they're going to
Right.
go pick up some other books by that person and really just feed on just the great banquet of wisdom that God has poured into some of these great minds. And just in terms of the role of assisting and serving, just with my work in publishing, you work with my good friend Brad Herman, who's the publisher
Mhm.
for Harrison House. Behind the scenes, we serve authors and leaders in all kinds
Right.
of different ways, and just in the day to day doing life with the leaders and pastors and authors that we get to serve. They mentor us, they teach us stuff, we learn things, but it's often not in a formal setting. It's in the green room, it's at a dinner, it's as
Totally.
we're randomly driving in the car going to do something. And so a lot of the best, most life changing experiences I've had with pastors and leaders wasn't anything we orchestrated. It wasn't just the glory cloud appeared on the stage. It was when we're doing really random, normal things, or just
Mhm.
driving to the store, or going to serve somewhere together. And so I just some of the best things come just in the very mundane, doing ministry and life
Yeah.
together. So just I've learned that through the years. You if you're willing to step out and serve, God will open up so many interesting doors and change your life through unexpected circumstances. It's not in the places that you think it should be that are all
Yeah.
fancy and wonderful and perfect. In terms of how this project impacted you, obviously every book kind of gives you sort of a snapshot of the season of the author's life that it came out of. But what caught my eyes is you talk about in the book that you just exclaimed to your wife one day, I had the best time with Dietrich Bonhoeffer this morning. So, like for you, just as you immerse yourself in these great minds, like how did they come? It sounds like they came alive to you in a new way as you were writing this book. I'd love to hear about that.
Yeah, they really did. And, and Sean, honestly, I feel like I just scratched the surface. But, when we get beyond just an occasional quote, which I love quotes, and on my website, I have a free quote section, thousands of quotes that, have impacted me. But, a person's life is more than the sum of a few, like I think you used the word pithy a bit ago, a few pithy sayings. And, like when you study Luther and Spurgeon, for example, and you find out that both of them battled depression and had significant emotional challenges of feeling unworthy and just despondent. And we look at them through the lens of history and say they accomplished so much. They should have been really proud of themselves, which I guess is kind of an oxymoron for a Christian to say that. You did so much for God. You should be really proud. No, proud goes before destruction. But really, they battled depression and they really had to fight through these things. And sometimes, we put leaders on pedestals, both past and present. And we don't realize, James concludes his book by saying, Elijah was a man of like passions as we are. But he prayed and, God did these wonderful things. And sometimes when we not just catch their clever little sayings or hear about their, great exploits, but sometimes when we really get to know the person, to kind of be able to, empathy, to being able to walk in another person's shoes a little bit, to as best we can to maybe feel what they felt, when Bonhoeffer was sitting in prison facing death. You know, just what Paul was facing sitting in prison in Second Timothy. Their words all of a sudden take on so much more life because we see the grace of God that was operating in their life. And so as best as I could, I tried to hopefully, if not give a bit of that flavor, at least, steer people to the sources where they can, if they're reading in this book and they see me continually quoting from Spurgeon's lectures to my students, they'll want to go back and grab that. And, John Wesley, he wrote a list. Wesley was big on lists. He was the reason they called them the Methodists back then is he was so methodical and he had so many rules, and modern audience might think that's legalistic, but really when you read most of what he said, it was the wisdom of God, and like his rules for an assistant. We put that as an entire section back in the appendix. So there are just so many things, wisdom from the ages. And boy, if we don't learn from the past, like someone famously said, if those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat, those same mistakes and things like that. But we have such a heritage and inheritance, from these people. I'll mention, let me see if I can find at the end of the book, we have a section called Meet Your Mentors. And we just give a little paragraph about each of these. William Booth, founder of the Salvation Army; E.M. Bounds, phenomenal on prayer; Oswald Chambers. One thing that's fascinating about Oswald Chambers is, and people don't know this, but he died quite young. And I think there are 42 or 43 books to his credit.
I think it wasn't like 41 or like early to mid 40s, very young.
He didn't write any of those. His wife wrote all those after he died. I think he had finished one manuscript before his death, but his wife, as a young girl, wanted to be the stenographer for the Prime Minister of England. So she studied. She became a phenomenal, what we call shorthand, that type of thing. This is before the days of recorders and all those things. And so he died, and she had manuscripts of every lesson he had ever done. She wrote all those books that are under his name. My Utmost for his highest, which sold 13 million, more than 13 million. She wrote that. And that was his thought. It was his messages, but she wrote the actual books. And so, we learn about partnership. We learn about teamwork. Just so many people to be thankful for, and to see how they maximized their potential, and often how they really poured their life into others and multiplied themselves by really discipling and mentor others. And we're not their personal disciples, but boy, we can still draw so much information from them and really get benefit.
Yeah, I can say with Oswald Chambers and My Utmost for His Highest, I think I first encountered that as a younger man in my 20s, and reading through it again in my 40s. Now I'm like, oh my gosh, his thoughts were so super deep. I with some of his ideas on the Holy Spirit, I'm like, man, if he wasn't like a card carrying, he was at least a closet charismatic with the depth of understanding that he had. One of the things I really wanted to have you speak to, Tony, was just this idea of kind of examining the influences of our lives and why we need mentors, kind of people to aspire to be like, so to speak, who are real people. And I say this in the sense that, or people who have actually accomplished something worthwhile or noteworthy. Because on the one hand, I see so many people, younger people especially, but even people in my generation, the people they look up to aren't real. They're characters in movies, characters in comic books, video games. So they're not real people who they've not actually accomplished anything. And they tend to not even look up to or consider anybody who's a real person that's like a peer time-wise now, or looking back to people in history who've accomplished important things, impacted the world in a great way. So to some degree, by and large, I feel because we've lost so much of our connection with history, we failed to learn about so many of these people that we could look up to. And so just big picture, really looking at the influences that impact us, and then just, again, reinforce why do we need mentors, people to aspire to be like, so to speak, and to learn from, who are actually real people who accomplish real things.
Yeah. We live in a society and a culture where it's so easy for superficiality to be so predominant. We see movies, and how much of that is CGI and how much of that is a stunt double. And, we see people playing roles and things of that nature. And I'm not against entertainment, but I'm just saying, that desire for reality, and, for somebody that's not just, for example, even in church, not one way in the pulpit and diametrically different in their personal life. I think people really crave genuineness. They crave authenticity. They don't just want somebody who can get up and put on a show on a platform. They want somebody who can actually live and is actually living it. And that doesn't mean that as preachers we're perfect or flawless. I think, leaders they're still human. They're still working out their salvation with fear and trembling, we hope. They're still growing in conformity to Christ and still growing in transformation. But, the Bible talks about bringing forth fruit worthy of repentance. And so we want people in our life who, even if they mess up, sometimes we learn by people doing the right things. Sometimes we learn by people when they recognize they've done the wrong thing. They are an example in the way they repent. And so, for example, I worked with the Hagen Ministries for 18 and a half years and traveled with Kenneth E. Hagen for a handful of years. And, I was in Brazil doing a pastor's conference years ago, and somebody said, in your years of working with Brother Hagen and your years of traveling with him, what was the most important lesson you ever learned from him? And wow, it was such a kind of how do you answer that question? And I think they were thinking of some deep revelation, something, Jesus told him in a personal visitation or something. And after I thought about it for a minute, I said, I think the most important thing I learned from Brother Hagen is he always gave his wife the best egg. And I could see these Brazilians, looking at me like, what are you talking about? And I said, well, the thing that impressed me about Brother, yes, he was a great preacher. Yes, he was a great Bible teacher, but he always honored his wife. I always saw him hold the door for her, hold the chair for her when she sat down. He was always a gentleman. And a story that he told is that every morning while she was getting ready, he would fix 2 eggs. And I guess he fried them, and whichever one looked the best, that was Aretha's egg, and he would take the one that, and so just little things like that you mentioned. They don't have to be things, in a big auditorium or in a big pulpit. Many times it's the exemplary things. Somebody once said, don't be concerned that your kids don't listen to you. Be concerned that they're watching you. And, because how many people have lived by the motto, don't do as I do, do as I say. Well, as Christian leaders, we're not putting ourselves up as the supreme example, but that's kind of a cop-out if we say that. At some point we need to be able to say with Paul, follow me as I follow Christ. And I think it was Howard Hendricks, the great professor, many years said, if you see me quit following Christ, quit following me. We always need to point people more to Jesus than to ourselves, but we also need to endeavor to represent him well. And that lifestyle, that example, that character demonstrated is some of the most important mentoring we will ever do.
Tony, next I'd love to have you speak to the idea of that we sometimes need to stay put even when we feel like it's time to run away and hide. If you're in any level of leadership, you're going to come up against problems and people and just seasons where everything goes to heck. And you're just like, this would be so easy if I just went down the street and worked at Subway. That was always my joke, my backup plan. I could go be a senior sandwich artist at Subway and just deal with bread and meat all day. Just that idea of as leaders, we're going to encounter hard things. How do we stay put and stay on mission, even when running feels like the best option?
That's such a great question. I think there's maybe a subliminal or subtle subconscious wish on our part that we'll always have an easy life, that will have free from conflict, free from difficulty, that type of thing. And so we assume then that if we're in God's will, it will be easy. So therefore, if I run into a spot in life that's not easy, it must not be God's will. So therefore, I need to leave and go search for the greener pastures and things of that nature. The problem is life is tough. Jesus made it very clear, you're going to have times where there's going to be conflicts with people. Paul said, Romans 12:18, he said this for a reason: if it is possible, as much as it depends on you, live peacefully with all men. So we just need to understand, wherever we are in life, there's going to be conflicts and difficulties. And if our first and initial impulse is always to run at the first sign of trouble, we're going to be running our whole lives. And I want to make it very clear, I do believe there are times for transitions in life. I think there can be phases of what we do. And I've had a couple transitions in 40 some years of ministry, and I'm not putting myself up as the standard. I'm not saying that's all anybody else should have, but if somebody is constantly jumping in and out of relationships, constantly jumping in and out of different jobs, and they only stay somewhere long enough until they run into some conflict and then they run. There's times to leave, but we want to leave for the right reasons. We want to leave on the right terms. And so many of the times, God really calls us to work through issues and not just run away from issues. And also to understand that, there are going to be some situations where we just have to work through challenges and that things aren't always going to be perfect. How long would marriages last if people thought, well, every day is just going to be euphoric and, ideal and that type of thing? Paul said, and when my wife and I have done marriage conferences, I always quote 1 Corinthians 7:28, which I tell the audience is the only New Testament promise about marriage. There are many commandments about marriage, but there's only one promise that I find. And that is, Paul said, 1 Corinthians 7:28, those who marry shall have trouble in the flesh. And so we have to understand we live in an imperfect world. I'm imperfect. You're imperfect. If we work together long enough, we're going to see things different. We're going to have some friction, whatever, but we work through that and we don't just run. One verse that I came across very early in ministry was where Paul said to Timothy, and I think it's at the very beginning of 1 Timothy. It may be second, but I think it's first. He said, and I have this in the King James in my mind. Paul says, I besought thee, Timothy, to abide still at Ephesus. And that abide still means, Timothy, I know it's tough there. I know it's hard. They wanted to kill me. I was glad to get out of there, but you stay there. And there's just something about continuing in situations when we're supposed to continue. If God releases us, wonderful. If we have to leave for some appropriate reason, or in cases like Paul, they were going to kill him, so he did get out of there. There's times to leave. If we can borrow the wisdom of Ecclesiastes, there's a time for this and a time for that. There is a time to leave, but there's many times to stay. And I think many people are just inclined to leave prematurely, impulsively, leave because, I'm offended. And instead of really working that through with God and, getting the wisdom of God and the timing of God, society just would not be good if people were just constantly bailing on every responsibility just because they got uncomfortable in it.
Well, that's something, my hope and my prayer is that every leader, really every person, can learn that in their younger days. Because, man, if you keep doing that into your 30s and 40s and 50s, it gets rougher because there's so much more at stake in terms of your family and just the impact of you just uprooting and constantly making
Right.
changes. The fallout is far greater. The one thing I realized is I had a range, and I started out in the tech and software space for about 11 years in my 20s and into my early 30s. And in that space, you often switch jobs a lot. But as I got to reflecting, I was like, the common denominator, I complain about the same things everywhere I go. I am actually the common thing in the center of all of this. And so you learn to be self-reflective, like, oh, I probably have some stuff that I need to work on. I think another thing too, I'll just comment on too. You have to really discern and pray into, okay, if the grace leaves for your role somewhere or the situation, sometimes it's just time to go, and that is,
Right.
it's something to really ask the Holy Spirit to give you discernment on how you should walk it out. But, on the one hand, you go, man, I really want to finish well and finish strong. And so my plan is I'm going to stick this out for another 6 months. Sometimes it's like, it's time to go now, or it's time to go in a month. Because if the grace has left, trying to finish well over 6 months, it's way worse than if you would, because sometimes the grace leaves, and that partly God saying, okay, it's time to go into that next thing. Obviously, a lot of prayer counsel from older, wiser men and women who speak into your life. That's always helpful in those situations. But just be honest with yourself. If the grace has left, be willing to leave. And if you're the person who, man, I've hopped from job to job to job, marriage to marriage to marriage, church to church to church, just know that you're the common person in the center of all those situations. So if you keep encountering the same thing everywhere you go, it might be time to press pause and just look at yourself and see what there is to see there. I think the place I'd love to land the interview is talk about the idea of looking at the man in the mirror. I think one of the challenges when we're somebody who's on a stage or behind a pulpit, or we've got TV shows and podcasts and all the things, people know our public persona. They pump us up. I always say they're blowing rainbows and unicorns and giving us lollipops, and they're so excited about our highlight reel. Things get really dangerous when we believe our own highlight reel and we stop looking at, really examining ourselves. Just in working with leaders for many years, I've been in so many multiple dinner conversations with leaders in different groups that they're speaking with. And when the only stories I hear is like, well, when I started out, God moved this and God did, like, there's no fresh fire in their life of what God's doing, I get nervous because I'm like, has God stopped moving in your life today? So just, I don't know. I feel like it can be a real trap when we believe the highlight reel. We're just trying to draft off of God moving in our life from 20 years ago. How do we be honest and really look at that person in the mirror? And I think you have sections in that chapter on pursuing purity, health, and balance. Yeah. How do we maintain a good balance and perspective there? Because there's a danger if we don't do that.
Yeah. One of the statements I think, I'm pretty sure I make it in this book, is that the last skill that most ministers learn is self-care. And I'm not talking about being self-indulgent. I'm talking about what Paul said. We have a section on this in the book where Paul said to Timothy, take heed to yourself. And I experienced this in ministry, and tons of minister friends have, that they get so busy taking care of everything else. They get so busy taking care of everybody else. They're carrying everybody else's burdens. They're constantly pushed to perform. They're constantly pushed to produce. They're putting out, churning out material. And what happens, there's an old saying, you've heard it, it's not original with me, that, if our outgo exceeds our income, our upkeep becomes our downfall. And how many ministers and how many people in other caring professions, years ago, psychologists, counselors came up with a term that was not just for ministers, but for anybody in a caring, serving profession. And it was called compassion fatigue. And they just give out and give out and give out. And eventually they become numb, and they have inner depletion of their inner emotional, spiritual reservoirs and resources. And so ministers have to realize that before they're a preacher, they're a person. And we can't fall in love with the pulpit. We can't fall in love with the platform. We can't fall in love with our image and forget the substance of our character and our integrity. And The word integrity is from a mathematical term, which is amazing. I would be quoting this. I'm a guy that got a D plus in algebra in high school. Math didn't work with my brain setup. But the word integer is where we get our word integrity, and an integer is a math term for a whole number. In other words, it doesn't have a fraction or a percentage in it. 2.5 is not a whole number. 1.7 is not a whole number. 5 is a whole number. And the reason integrity entails wholeness, it means our life is not fractionalized or even compartmentalized to where half is in and half is out, or 9% is in and 10% is out. It means that every fiber of our being is aligned with the character, with the holiness, with the goodness of God, and that we're not living a duplicitous life. We're not one person in the pulpit and another person at home. And, D.L. Moody said, and we quote him on this in Search of Paul, D.L. Moody said, I have more trouble with D.L. Moody than with any other man I know. And Charles Spurgeon said, we quote him here as well, he said, it is terribly easy to be I don't remember his exact verbiage, a preacher of the gospel and a terrible hypocrite at the same time. So when Paul said to Timothy, take heed to yourself, we can't save the world and let ourselves go down the tubes. It doesn't work that way.
Well, and that's one of the things I'm always looking for in terms of leaders who are transparent. I get encouraged when I see somebody who's the same in the pulpit, in a business meeting, at a dinner with fancy special people, at a dinner with just normal lay people. If you're the same guy or gal in all of those spaces, I get excited. It's like, man, I want to work with this person because they're living a transparent life, and they're being their kingdom person the same in all the places.
Right.
When I see somebody who's one way in the pulpit, one way in a business meeting, one way with people who can do favors for you, another way with people who can't give you anything, it's fractured. You're performing differently in each of those scenarios, and sadly that can be. It's not rare across leaders necessarily, but for leaders in higher positions of influence, it can feel kind of rare. So it's been wonderful to have that behind the scenes perspective and to get to meet a lot of people who are they're transparent and they are who God created them to be everywhere they go. And just one last comment before we get ready to wrap up too. I think we're attracted to the influence, the title, the power that comes with something. Yet I don't feel like we fully understand it. And the deeper we go into a position or a place of influence, we understand the burden of it as we get deeper further on the journey. But we often see somebody who's, attained a certain level of favor and influence in their 40s and 50s and 60s. Like, man, I really, really want that. But again, having no idea of just the intense, often multi-decades of stewardship and carrying very heavy weights to get to that place. Some of the most influential people I've met throughout my career who we get excited to go hear them preach, and they're on stages and they write books. When you just get into their life and know what they've had to carry, they're some of the most broken people who have had to walk through the most difficult, atrocious seasons of life. Right. And yet it's that fire that has refined them into who they are. And it's why they can do what they do. And so just know, even though you're attracted to the position they have, just know that it came at a great cost. And so if that's the path God has you on, just know you're going to have to pay that same cost. You don't get to the top of that mountain, so to speak, without taking the journey that it takes to get you there. Tony, in terms of people connecting with you, finding out more about your books, your ministry, speaking schedule, all the things, where do we discover you on the web?
Okay. Our website, we tried to keep it real simple. It's just my name. It's Tony Cooke, TonyCooke.org, O-R-G. And all of we have a lot of free resources there to help people grow, and free articles, sermons, audio, video, quotes, stories, all kinds of things, as well as bookstore and itinerary, things like that. So we invite people to check that out.
And we'll make it easy like we do with every episode. We'll have links in the show notes to Tony's website, as well as links to places where you can pick up your very own copy of his new book. It's time to bring this episode of the Sean Tabbitt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with Tony Cooke. Once again, our book today was In Search of Paul, Unleashing the Power of Legendary Mentors in Your Life. And Tony, I want to say thank you so much for sharing with us today. It's been an honor and a pleasure to have you back on the show.
Sean, thank you much. Appreciate it.